We start the white magic class. We're leaving off on astral astral forces to master is what we're talking about. And the first major astral force to master, he lists 5 of them, and he's going to talk in depth of 2 of them. He says the first 2 are by far the most important. If we handle them, the rest will take care of themselves. The first is fear, which is a big one. Second is depression, which is fitting since we were just talking about that. And third is desire for satisfaction of the animal appetites. Fourth, desire for happiness. And 5, desire for liberation or aspiration. These are all astral forces, and he says the 2 most important are fear and depression, or its opposite, hilarity. So we'll consider these first 2. First of all, he says the disciple must not suppress the various forces he has to deal with, but meet them directly and learn to handle them and put them in the right place. And fear is a big thing. As we said earlier, he made the interesting statement that it's in the warp and woof matter itself. And fear is a plague that causes all kinds of problems with humanity. We even wars and attacks and crime, many things are caused, have fear as part of the root cause. He says fear forms the dweller for many, especially the Ray 2 people. Not so much with Ray 1, which aren't that many Ray 1 people, but Ray 2 people, and a lot of people into metaphysics and psychology are on Ray 2. Now, he points out that fears change depending on the evolution. Fear, for instance, is in animals. And what causes fear in animals, do you think? Animals have one basic fear. And what is that?
You're getting killed.
Right. Fear they're going to get killed or injured. And they're concerned for their physical safety, and everything is built around that. And so it's interesting with the animals in the wild how they have certain triggers that register fear. We went on a hayride a number of years ago to this farmer give people hayrides to go feed elk. And he pointed out what made these elk afraid. He says, if you're sitting down, he says, they won't be afraid. He said, now don't stand up. If you stand up, they'll all run, because that's a trigger in their mind that makes them afraid, and they will just run like crazy. But if you sit still, we can go up and they'll come right up to you. And sure enough, they came right up, and you could pet them and everything, you know, as long as you didn't stand up. So I thought that was kind of weird. He says there's certain other things that trigger things in these animals. Like, he says they've registered that if they hear a chainsaw, that means food. Because if people are out cutting down trees, on the trees there are certain things that they can eat. So when they hear a chainsaw, they figure somebody's cutting down a tree, and they will run and try to find that tree and eat some of the goodies off of it. And he says it's would be unfair for hunters to go out with a chainsaw, turn the chainsaw on, that would attract the elk. And something I never heard of anyone doing before. But there's just certain triggers in the animal kingdom that trigger certain feelings in them. Now, when we go to primitive humans, fear goes to another level. What's the next level it goes to in primitive humans?
The fear of the
survival.
How primitive are we talking?
Yeah, we're say savages in jungles, you know, or that
There's the fear of the
natives in
unknown.
jungles and native tribes, for instance. What kind of fears do they have? Now they have the same fears as animals. They're afraid of. They have fears connected with survival. They carry that over, but also they have a lot of superstitions, don't they?
Afraid of the gods.
Yeah, they're afraid of the gods. They pray for sacrifice virgins to appease the gods so they can have good weather and different things like that. So their
How
fears.
about fire? Animals are naturally
What's say?
fire. Animals are naturally afraid of fire.
Yeah,
Because it
That's-
can kill and hurt them.
that's because fire can kill them. A lot of animals have a racial memory of fires that you know, started burned an entire forest and killed many of their kind. So I think there's a built-in instinctual memory about fire. But I think that's connected with their survival too. You know. But anyway, primitive humans, they acquire new ones, and as we evolve through the human kingdom, we kind of keep that fear of the gods for some time. Even a lot of fairly evolved people have an undue fear of the wrath of God being poured out on them if they offend certain people. And this is the power that the beast has on us, in the fact that the beast represents allegiance to an outer God over the inner. So because people have their focus on an outer God, this outer God has power to put tremendous fear into them. So say an authority in a church tells you, you know, if you don't do what I say, because I understand God's will, and I'm an agent of God's will. If you don't please me, you're going to go to hell, burn forever. So this puts a fear of God into this person. Overcoming this fear is a tremendous step for the disciple, because, you know, thinking of being punished forever in the eternities by God is terrifying for many people. Yeah, what were you saying, Joshua?
I had another thought about that. And it's like, I guess part of this maybe comes about part of a Jordan Peterson video somebody was criticizing. But
Yeah.
it's like, to look at it more broadly, it's like fear of the head of the hierarchy.
Yeah.
And you know, it could be a god because a god like gives the leader the power to be in charge, or it could be the leader or whatever.
Yeah, and what's interesting is the real hierarchy works through your own soul. Matter of fact, this is the way DK says that Jesus performed healings. He says he performed healings by looking upon the person's soul and seeing the perfection there, and then causing the perfection to manifest to the person himself. And so even with healings, the master of masters work through the person's own soul. And the same thing with teaching us. You notice when you receive something from the inside that it has no force.
That's how he assured them.
I mean, it doesn't impose itself on you. It gives you complete freedom to accept or reject.
JJ, I'm having a really hard time hearing you. Will you have Sean mute?
What?
I'm having a really hard time hearing you because somebody's not muted. I can hear a car.
Oh, okay. Okay, everybody make sure you're on mute unless you're talking. Okay, is that any better?
Absolutely. Bless you.
Okay, great. So we evolve in our fears, and as the person becomes a disciple, he accumulates a certain amount of fear of failure and fear of not performing, a fear of his own caused by his own insecurities. He says, all fear is related to a sense of loss of some type, like the animals fear losing their lives. Primitive man fears of losing their crops because God is angry. More advanced man fears of losing his soul because he offends God. And then more advanced still fears of losing his approval of his brothers or something like that. There's always some fear of loss. And in the whole scheme of things, there's no such thing as loss, but that doesn't really help us down here on the earth to even have a mental understanding of that, because I mean, let's suppose somebody stole $1,000 from you tomorrow. I mean, who wouldn't have some sense of loss about that? You know, it's there's a certain attachment we have as we are incarnated into this life that there's really no way to neutralize 100%. We can do it to a certain degree, but very few people can do it perfectly. Okay, he says, fear is a quality of evil or matter which colors the astral or sentient body of the planetary logos itself. So that's an interesting statement. So quality matter, it actually colors his entire body. It is inherent, in fact, of matter itself, and in the plays of the pairs of opposites, soul and matter. It's related to a sense of imprisonment, of limitation, and of consequent inadequacy. And he says he wants to deal with the fears of average people, and the fear of death is a major one. And he talks about other things that cause fear here. He makes a list. One is a terror of the final rendering process and the act of death itself. So fear of death is a really big one. The horror of the unknown and doubt as to whether or not we have a final immortality or not. That's a doubt that plagues even advanced souls. Unhappiness at leaving loved ones behind or being left behind. It's another fear. Ancient reactions to past violent deaths lying deep in the subconscious. Now, I found this in regressing different people that different types of violence they had in their past life still affects them in this life and causes phobias and knee-jerk reactions and even disease. I took this one gal back and to England, and she was in an orphanage, and in this orphanage in the hundreds of years ago, when they had excess kids they couldn't take care of, they just killed them and dispatched them. And the way they killed her was they just cut her head off. And it's amazing how when you look back in history, how primitive they were compared to today. We think we're bad today, but you know, can you imagine having an orphanage where you got too many to take care of, so you just kill the excess ones? You know, wouldn't happen. What's say?
Was this like 18 something?
Yeah, this 1800s in England, she said.
And there was this one woman who killed like hundreds of kids, right?
What's say?
There was this one woman who killed like hundreds of kids.
It's quite possible. This one I took back, she didn't go into that detail, but they took her down in this dungeon and they cut her head off. And in this life, she had neck aches throughout her life, went to all kinds of doctors, and nobody ever, her neck seemed fine, and they couldn't explain how come she had big pain in her neck all the time. But after I took her back and she relived that, once I saw that that was the cause, I had her relive it a couple times. It was painful for her to do it, but it was important for her to do it so she could get it out of her system. And then I met her a couple years later, and I asked her about that, and she said ever since I did the regression on her, she had no pain in her neck. It just eliminated the problem. So there's a lot of things from past lives. If you have unexplained fears that you just don't understand, it's probably connected with a past life. And so it might be a good idea to go to professional regressionists and relive that. If you can get back to that past life and then relive it until you can look at it without feeling pain. That's what you have to do. You have to go through that pain and relive it. Sometimes you have to do it several times until you can look at that incident and not feel disturbed. Look at it from the observer. When you can do that, then you can have the problem in the current life healed. Another thing that causes fear is clinging to the form life, because permanently it's identified with it in your consciousness. So if you the form is so important to many people, and they're afraid of having anything happen to that form. And then he says, the old erroneous teaching as to heaven and hell, both equally unpleasant prospects to certain types. I like that wording. He says both heaven and hell are equally unpleasant. And when you think of the regular Christian idea of heaven, or even Muslim idea where you go and have a bunch of virgins wait on you for eternity, or where you go and sing praises and play a harp for eternity, I mean, that would be, that's almost as bad as hell, according to the Tibetan. So thought that was kind of interesting statement. He points out that death is an important thing that causes fear, and he says that it's important for the disciple to realize that there, in the final scheme of things, there is no death. We merely have a transition where the life essence is taken from our body and moved to another location. And so death as we know it is really just separation of spirit from body, so to speak. But there's still consciousness, there's still life after the body dies. Now, he points out that after we die, he says, we enter a field. Well, there's several places we can go. You know, you can go to like the, he says certain people that are like earthbound after they die, if they're very attached to this life, they can be, their spirits will remain, their etheric bodies will remain behind for some period of time. And they will can create problems here. He points out that there must be some pretty ancient spirits. He even talks about spirits from Atlantis creating problems. But during our sleeping hours, we return to the soul, and this is where we go if we're not like earthbound. Then we return to our own souls and unite with them. So he says for the aspirant, for the lower beginning soul, he doesn't leave his body with a very high state of consciousness, but for a fairly evolved soul, he returns quite quickly to his soul, and he says he enters back into a realm that seems very familiar to him once he leaves his body.
JJ, where does he say that stuff about spirits from Atlantis lingering and causing trouble?
It says it in this chapter. Let me see where he see if it's in my notes here. He doesn't go into much detail, but he points out that, can't see it here. I don't know if I wrote that down in my notes or not. But he points out there's ancient entities from Atlantis that cause problems for mediums and different things, and contacts them, gives them wrong information. And take a quick look here.
But it might not be human entities, or
No, it's some type of human entity that existed in Atlantis. That kind of made me wonder, because usually a person doesn't spend too much time in the astral etheric zones before he returns to his soul. So I found it interesting. He talked about these entities from Atlantis.
if you find the page later, let me know.
Yeah, after the class is over, I'll post that on Messenger for you, and post the link there. I'm sure I can find it. Okay, he says in his sleeping hours, the disciple has developed a field of service and of learning. He now simply functions in it for 24 hours a day, so to speak, if you want to figure days, talking in terms of physical plane, instead of his usual few hours of earthly sleep. So when we're sleeping, our emotional consciousness remains in our body and is responsible for the crazy dreams that we have that don't make any sense. But the mental part of ourself returns to the kingdom of the soul. And when it comes back, it doesn't have any memory because it was disconnected from the body. But then after we die, we can spend 24 or all of our time in that sphere. He says by the end of this century that we're in now, the fear of death will be replaced with an understanding of life after death. That there will be a lot of people that will be in contact with the spirit world. So there will be so many, he says, by the end of the century that it'll be common knowledge that there is no death. And the fear of death will be minimized by the year 2100, according to him. And then he also says,
JJ,
yeah,
I taught the grandkids, actually my own kids, anybody who will listen, basically, that if they die in heaven to get born, and we celebrate them here on their birth year, every year on their birth date, well then why don't they have a birth date in where they go to next and die here to get there? So you have to be somewhere. When you die there, you move here. We celebrate you here. You die here, you go there, then you get a birthday there too.
Well, except they don't measure time there the way that we do, so I don't know how that would fit in.
I only told children the idea.
Since it seems kind of timeless on the other side, but
I know that. But
yeah, the Tibetan makes an interesting point. He says if we had a higher knowledge of everything, we would fear being born a lot more than we would fear dying. He says, because being born is a lot tougher than dying. So
amen.
Dying, you go to a lot nicer place, normally, unless you got a lot of mental problems.
But it's a good idea, though, isn't it? To move from one place to the other, one death, one birth.
Yeah, maybe we celebrate the day we died in the next world. Who knows?
Yeah.
And he points out another thing about life after death. He says in another place, doesn't say it here, but he says science will eventually develop a device that will allow us to communicate with people who have passed over. And he points out that the most material of all the thinkers will wind up making one of the greatest spiritual advances. I thought that was kind of a funny statement. that these atheist type scientists will wind up creating an invention that will prove there's life after death. But he points out there's a technique of dying just as there is of living. But this technique is, he says, is basically lost except for a few people in the East know how to know about the techniques. He describes it in other places a little bit, like he says that you need to have a person in a quiet place with orange light, and it puts them in a suitable mood to be able to make the transition easily. Another major fear people have is a fear of the future. There's a lot of books written about how to overcome worry that telling us that almost all the things we worry about don't even happen. So all that worry that we put in the worry was for nothing. A good book on this, if anyone's plagued with excessive worry, is by Dale Carnegie, called I think it's How to Stop Worrying and Start Living, or something like that. And it was a pretty good book, and he pointed out that the fruitlessness of most worry, that like I say, almost all the stuff that we worry about doesn't happen. Every once in a while, something you worry about does happen. And when it does happen, it's usually not as big of a problem as the worry was that you just went through. So you just never know. So people worry about the future. He says this will cause much distress in the world before it's obliterated. And this worry of the future grows out of three human capacities. One, the instinct to self-preservation, and the power of the mind to imagine. So the animals, for instance, they don't worry about the future at all. They just worry about right now. If they see some guy with a rifle or an animal that's going to eat them, they'll worry about that when the time happens. If there's no animal around or no threat around, they don't worry at all. They just eat and enjoy themselves. Now, us humans aren't that way at all. We look into the future, which animals don't. And we see things that might happen. And so we think, well, you know, I might have this accident, or this might happen, or I might lose the love of my life, or this. And so we imagine all these things that might happen. Olshoff is handling it pretty good in Israel. Instead of thinking of all the terrorists that might happen, he's thinking of the security that he has, you know. So he's got the right attitude there. So
it's like living in a film.
So it's a natural tendency for us to look in the future and see things that might happen. Is there going to be a financial collapse tomorrow? Is the Democrats and Republicans going to make a civil war here in America? Is apocalypse coming? And so our imaginations run wild, and this causes a lot of fear in humanity. And the Tibetan says it's going to take a little bit of time for us to work through that, because our minds are kind of not under our control the way they should be. He says, fear of the future is therefore a distressing blend of instinctual memory and anticipatory imagination, and few there are who escape this menace. Worry and anxiety are the lot of every man, and cannot and will not be offset and overcome by any lesser factor than what? What do you think? What's the factor that will overcome the fear of the future?
The soul itself.
Well, somebody read the lesson. Good. Right, that's right. The soul itself. The soul itself is the only thing that will prevent us from having fear of the future. Because once the mind becomes active, and the average person, he's got a number of fears about the future. But when you contact the soul and you feel a peace about the future, where you're headed anyway, then that fear is minimized. there's still things to be concerned about, but you will be able to be concerned without without having fear. So the soul contact is an important ingredient to minimize that. Another cause of fear is flashes of prevision. We get, and this sometimes comes partially from the soul, but sometimes the disciple will misunderstand or not get the full picture, and he'll get a feeling, a sense of something is going to be happening in the near future. Maybe he gets a sense there's going to be a war somewhere. Okay, there's always going to be a war somewhere, just about. So maybe he'll start worrying about that, and maybe he'll misinterpret that prevision to think, well, my country is going to be involved in a war, and he starts amplifying it in his mind, and so this sense of prevision he has, because of the distortions that the mind gives him, causes him to have a lot more fear than is necessary, a lot more concern than is necessary.
And
like I say,
disturbance in the force.
What's say, Rick?
It's a great disturbance in the force.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that disturbance in the force, that's really cute, because for people that are in contact with the spiritual energies, when there is something to be concerned about, you will feel a disturbance in the force. Does that kind of resonate with everybody here, that term, disturbance in the force? Yeah. And disturbance in the force doesn't need to cause you to fear, but it means there's something that you need to pay attention to so that you can solve it. That's what it means. And if you feel a disturbance in the force, you might have a tendency to fear a lot more than you should, but the tendency should be there's a correction that needs to be made, and you can have a part in doing it. And when you feel a disturbance in the force, that's where it should lead you.
It should just be reduced down to it's that tension that comes before the step up. Point of tension, I think your words are.
Yeah, the point of tension. He says, all humanity has to do to make a peaceful life is something very simple, just to have goodwill and brotherhood toward each other. If we could do this person to person, nation to nation, race to race, he says, almost all of our problems and fears would be solved. He says, and I like the way he words this, he says, so simple a rule, and yet utterly beyond the mental grasp of the majority. I like the way he words that. Utterly beyond the mental grasp of the majority, yet it's so simple. Just be nice, in other words. So, yeah, it just kind of comes down to those two words. Just be nice to everybody. And if everybody just did that one thing, very so simple, but so beyond the grasp of the majority.
Well, I had I don't want to interrupt if you want to continue.
Yeah, go ahead.
I noticed this, I guess maybe it's always been a thing, but I noticed it last Christmas, that I could really feel like things were like different and positive, because I guess so many people were had good feelings and tried to be better people. But then, of course, Christmas goes away and people go back to...
Yeah, it's kind of that way. People criticize Christmas, but people do try to be a little friendlier and nicer at Christmas time. Unless they're at a shopping mall with a big sale on, and running over each other to get the products, But outside of that, overall, people do tune in a little bit more to the Christ energy, which is good.
I have some stored information in my head on those Atlanteans, if anybody's interested, just quickly.
Huh?
What was that?
The Atlanteans that you were talking about, the DK mentioned.
Yeah.
That problem actually began back in Lemuria, and it was the hierarchy, whatever they were calling themselves at the time, the Lemurian civilization grew so fast that they needed a way to introduce people to the morality that was the founding gem of their civilization. And so they created religions. And by the time of Atlantis, the religions had become so corrupt that these high priests had built up so much karma that they could no longer even incarnate. So they do all their trying to control people from the mental plane, and they're known as black mentalists.
Oh yeah, Richard talked about that, didn't he?
Yeah, which made a lot of sense. And it's sort of backed up with Blavatsky's History of the World and all that. It's like, yeah, I can see the same story in different words here. That basically, and I can see why DK is hesitant to talk about it, because the idea of creating religions was kind of the brotherhood idea, but they didn't have it wasn't called the brotherhood back then. That didn't come along till Atlantis.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, getting back to fear here, he says, now another problem with fears is that sensitive people tune into the suffering of others. He says, not only in this world, but in the astral plane and ancient evils. And this was a part where he talked about Atlantis, but I don't have it in my notes. And he says it tunes into even ancient evils back in the days of Atlantis. And, but there's a lot of people, they call themselves empaths that are very sensitive about the suffering of other people. And a lot of them go through a lot of suffering themselves, because if somebody else is suffering, they feel that they need to suffer also. And this is something that people have to work through. It's like one of the thoughts I posted a while back saying that a person needs to have empathy for other people, but not identify too strongly, or else it can drive him crazy. And so this, we want to avoid that. But when you think of it, there's untold suffering in the world. If we identified with all the suffering in the world right now for even 1 minute, it would be probably wouldn't be able to stay alive. It would be so devastating. And not only this planet, but there's billions of planets in the universe, and they have all kinds of suffering on them. And there's probably somewhere in the universe, there's some star system that's about ready to go to explode, and will destroy everybody on the entire solar system. So there's all kinds of crazy things going on in the universe. So if you want to identify with everything, you know, you're going to have a hard time. And so this is why we're separated. We're one, but thank God we're separated in consciousness to the extent that we don't feel the suffering of every other person on the planet. So we're separated in consciousness for this reason. When we're down here in this world, we have to have a certain degree of separation to remain sane. Now in the next world, we're in the kingdom of the soul, where there is no physical suffering. We can be more united and be more tuned into each other without negative repercussions, because there's not the suffering there that there is here. But here, where there's great suffering, we need certain walls of separation, and we don't want to let them down too much. Let them down enough so you understand other people's suffering, but don't identify with it too strongly. It says another major fear factor is physical pain itself. People fear the pain of suffering if they get an accident or get a disease or that type of thing. He makes an interesting thing about pain. He says it's all right to use anesthetics and to a degree, but not something that causes a habit with a narcotic or a drug. He says avoid that, but it's all right for disciples to use a certain amount with wisdom. And he makes this interesting point that advanced disciples will eventually be able to leave their body during an operation, so they won't feel any pain in their body at all, and a doctor can do heart surgery or whatever on them with no anesthetic, and then when they're done, he'll just enter back into his body and his feeling will come back. So I thought that was kind of interesting statement. I've had a number of procedures done, like root canals with no Novocaine or anything, but I still felt the pain, but just ignored it. But it would be nice to be able to just leave your body during a painful period and then come back when the pain's over. And so that's one benefit from people who learn to astral travel, perhaps. We'll have to talk to Keith about that. Keith is the expert on astral travel. We'll have to ask him if he could leave his body and have an operation without forcing his consciousness back in his body.
I found chatting Om helps get rid of pain. It helps.
Oh, yeah? I never tried that. Of course, in a dentist's office, that come across a little weird.
Oh.
He'd think you're saying, ow. Okay. He says another cause is fear of failure. We touched on that. He says this is largely caused by a feeling of being inferior to the task at hand, along with imagination running wild. So that imagination is really a sore point that produces additional fear in whatever we're tackling. So that has to be taken under control. And the soul is a big help. Another big help, like I say, is just coming to the realization. You might ask yourself sometimes, well, what's the worst that could happen? And you figure the worst that could happen, and probably that's not going to happen. And even if the worst happens, you're still going to survive. You will still be you. Well, even if you die, you'll be reborn in another life, and you will still exist. So even if the worst happens, you will still be a survivor in one sense or another. But normally you're not going to die. Normally you're going to survive whatever it is you're fearing. Now he says, next to fear, the major astral force to deal with is depression. And he says depression is more widespread than people realize. And that's probably really true. You meet a lot of people that just seem really happy, and then later on when you dig in, when they start sharing their lives a little bit, you find they went through major periods of depression. And have you ever come across somebody that committed suicide that you thought was just living a good life? How about you? Has anybody comment on that?
It's a lot of different things besides anxiety.
What about that comedian,
Freddie Prinze? Freddie
Robert Williams?
Oh, Robin Williams?
No,
yeah.
Yeah, he was, nobody thought that he would commit suicide, and where was he at in his thinking?
Yeah, I understand they dug up some stuff that he had some type of illness that I can't remember what it was. I think he was experiencing some dementia that was causing him depression and would interfere with his livelihood. But the one that really surprised me was Freddie Prinze. Does anyone remember him?
The older Freddie Prinze, the younger.
Yeah, he has a son that's acting, Freddie Prinze Jr., but Freddie Prinze Sr., he committed suicide when he was in his 20s, and he was just on top of the world, very famous at a young age, and he was on Johnny Carson just several days before he committed suicide, and he seemed really happy, had it all together. He had everything going for him, and no one could understand why a few days later he committed suicide. I mean, it was just baffling. But
did they ever find out why he did that?
I've never heard why. Nobody could figure it out. He just seemed to have everything together. He had wealth, fame, didn't seem to have any problems, and then all of a sudden he just kills himself. And this is what the Ben says, that it's a lot more widespread than people think. There's a lot of people experiencing it that just doesn't share, that puts on a happy face, and you don't know what they're going through. But he says, few escape its attacks. It is like a miasma fog, which environs the man and makes it impossible for him to see clearly, walk surely, or recognize reality. That's the truth. They have a hard time, depressed people have a hard time recognizing reality. If they could recognize reality, they'd never try to commit suicide, because when you commit suicide, you're not extinguishing yourself. You're still alive. And you're going to be very disappointed with yourself that you did that when you wake up in another sphere. So it doesn't get you out of anything. And so you have to have reality distorted to even think about committing suicide. And he talks about here the causes of depression. And he says there are certain types of forces out there that influence us, that cause depression in people. World Glamour, he says, astrological forces come in that we have to deal with, that we have different ones that come into play, and they influence the masses. Well, Robert, good to see you.
Hi.
He able to make it here, right? Great.
I know I'm at work now. I'm sorry.
Yeah, welcome. Okay. So anyway, astrological factors. Then he says the seasons. He says primarily the autumn and early winter months cause people feel more depressed during this time period than the summertime. That has to do a lot with light too, because people that there's a lot of people feel depressed in the winter, they've found, because they don't get enough sunlight. There's something in the natural sunlight that eliminates depression in some people. Now, some people aren't bothered. Like, it doesn't bother me. Winter time doesn't depress me at all. But my friend Wayne was that way. He was very depressed in the winter time. And then I found out that you can buy lamps that have with full spectrum bulbs, and if you have full spectrum bulbs in your house, then that simulates sunlight, so that'll help people suffer from that type of depression from lack of sunlight. So
despite the light,
you can buy those in most stores these days. What'd you say, Rick?
Despite the light conditions, December 31 is always a big depression kind of date, because like the thought is, oh, another year and I still didn't finish that project, or
Yeah. Plus December 21st is the least sunlight of the whole year, so that's probably people probably with that sensitivity are probably most depressed right around Christmas time. Christmas time is depressing for people that don't have much money. Everybody else out spending money, and people who don't have much money feel depressed because they can't buy decent presents for their kids and stuff like that. That's affects people. Okay, he says, then the dark half of the moon in its waning period, people are more depressed than when the moon is brighter. That's one I'd never heard of before. And then he says, then there's forces entering our planet that cause self-absorption, unrest, distrust, kind of like we're having now with people either loving or hating Trump. Must be from these forces that Ben's talking about that causes unrest. Okay. Then he says astral polarization. causes depression. Too many people identify too strongly with their feeling nature, and the feelings distort reality. So the key to avoid depression is to really have a true vision of what is real and not real. To be able to discern the real from the unreal eliminates most depression. And the trouble with being subject to the astral forces, the feeling nature, and having it control you is it distorts reality. And so the feelings distorting reality is a big cause. He said there's one factor aspirants recognize. It's the need of freeing themselves from the great illusion. Arjuna knew this and yet succumbed to despair. Yet in his hour of need, Krishna failed him not, but laid down in the Gita simple rules whereby depression and doubt can be overcome. And he says they can be summarized as follows, and he gives a list of things that Arjuna was given to overcome his despair. First, know yourself to be the undying one. Okay, if you know that nothing can really kill you, even if your body gets destroyed, then that helps. You know, you think, I will live another day no matter what happens. Okay, second, control thy mind, for through that mind the undying one can be known. Okay, by controlling your mind, directing it to the soul, you can know that a greater reality. Okay, next, learn that the form is but the veil which hides the splendor of divinity. Fourth, realize that the one life pervades all forms, and there is no death, no distress, and no separation in the true reality. 5, detach yourself, therefore, from the form side and come to me, so dwelling in the place where light and life are found. The illusion then ends. So those are the keys that Krishna gave for overcoming this depression and fear of failure. He says astral polarization leads people to be swept up in mass feeling and hysteria, such as world war, financial panic, religious revival, or lynching. And so these astral illusions are terrible to affect the feeling nature. When the feeling nature is affected with illusion, then the person is in danger of depression. And the opposite of this, he calls hilarity. Hilarity is like, well, in a bar where everybody's laughing and telling jokes, or maybe making fun of somebody because he's stupid or something like this, and everybody's laughing at this. He says this type of hilarity is similar to depression, but just the opposite pole. He says there's nothing wrong with being lighthearted, but this hilarity that he speaks of is is a distorted form of merriment. He says that the disciple should avoid. Okay, the other thing that causes depression, he says, is a devitalized condition of the physical body. And this is due to various causes, such as a depleted etheric or vital body. And this is usually caused by some type of wrong circulation of energy in your body, where maybe one of your centers has a blockage of energy, and your vital body becomes low energy, and in a state of low energy, you're more susceptible to depression. He says physical diseases from various causes also. Yeah, if you're really sick, it's really hard to be be good mood all the time. And then he says climate. Now we talked a little bit about touched on that, but he says certain types of climate are good for people's moods. Like in the old days, especially, not so much now, but it used to be if you had certain problems, the doctor would often say, move to Arizona or somewhere, or move to a different climate. and this will help you out, sometimes physically, sometimes mentally. So find the climate that's good to fit your mood if you're going to live there for the rest of your life. Okay. One thing he didn't cover too much was attitude. He doesn't talk about that very much, but you know, attitude is just using your will to put your mind in a good state of positive focus. I think is important, and it's something that we can all do to a degree. I know that's what I do with myself, and I put myself in a state of positive focus, try to stay in touch with your soul. Your soul helps a great deal. Now it says these two factors, fear and depression, constitute for man the dweller on the threshold in this age and cycle. Both of them indicate sentient reaction to psychological factors and cannot be dealt with by the use of another factor such as courage. They must be met by the omniscience of the soul working through the mind, not by its omnipotence. Lotta says some interesting things in there. So he said there are certain factors with fear and depression just can't be overcome by being courageous or making up your mind. Sometimes the only solution is soul contact. And contacting the soul will then send you a comforting energy in certain situations. So he says that's the ultimate solution. But I do know that just there's a big difference in a lot of people with just attitude. If you have a positive attitude, that can take you many miles in the right direction. Okay, any comments? Anybody want to comment how they stay in a good mood? Let's find somebody that's always in a good mood here, like Mindy, you're always in a good mood. How do you handle that?
I talked to Dan.
Hey, leave me out of
this. We've been arguing back and forth for days.
Oh, have you? Have you?
Not really arguing, debating, discussing.
Okay, well, Dan's a pretty cheerful guy most of the time, so he's probably a fun guy to talk to.
He is.
Yeah. And Annie, I've never seen you in a bad mood. How do you stay so cheerful all the time?
Well, actually, I think I learned it as a child because I had a mother who was very worried always.
Oh,
and
really?
from the day I was born, I was, I kind of decided to keep her happy. So I learned to always look at the bright side of life, you could say. And that was really a gift she gave me because it's easy to do that today. I think that's how I learned it.
Well, good. Well, another person I think always seems to be in a good mood is Marnie. Marnie, are you there? I'm picking on the females. The females seem most cheerful of the bunch today for some reason.
She's not here right now. She had to run.
Oh, okay. Well, she's always seems very cheerful. Is she that way just with us or with you too?
She has her moments, but yeah, she's pretty positive person. So
yes.
It's just her normal disposition, I think.
Yeah, I can see why you're attracted to her. She just seems to brighten everybody's day when she's around them.
Yep.
Okay.
I always get in a really, really good, happy mood whenever I'm involved in group chats, either like Zoom or also at meetings in Second Life virtual world. I just have a big old grin on my face the whole evening.
Well, you know, one thing that cheers most people up is just being around good friends. And we're all good friends here, and hopefully we reinforce each other and cheer each other up a little bit. And so, you know, relationships is what it's all about. After all, if we wind up in heaven, it's going to be heaven because we're going to be around people that are nice to be around. And if you're there all alone, if you died and just went to a place where you're in some box all alone, I mean, that would be hell, wouldn't it? Probably the worst hell you can think of is just being isolated for eternity. But imagine eternity where you are with all kinds of very pleasant, interesting people. And then in the end, where everything goes back to the one, where intermingled with trillions of other entities that we can relate to. And that would be a blissful situation beyond anything we can understand at the moment. Okay, any other comments or questions before we wrap it up?
I want to, muted. There we go. I wanted to mention, I was just watching a video that featured Michio Kaku, the Japanese physicist with the long white hair.
Oh, yeah.
And anything that guy says is just, I love listening to it. And it keeps me thinking that, you know, we got to get JJ to be more of a celebrity, get on here with these other guys. Because whenever I'm watching the video, it's always like, I wonder what JJ's side of the story would be. You know,
I like that guy too. He's one of my favorite scientists because he's got a really good attitude about everything. Seems to.
I think if you hooked up with this group of people, like the Hoaglunds and the ones that are about the astronauts, ancient astronauts, and all this, there's a whole select group, and they support each other. They talk about each other's videos, about each other, what each other say, and it's like. It makes it's good for all of them being in this group because they get they get millions of hits.
Yeah.
And I think
why don't you get that going, JJ?
After I finish, I'm finishing up the Seeker's Guide, and then when I finish it, I'm going to experiment with making some videos.
Yeah,
so,
we'll help you. We'll give you illustrations and whatever. I'm sure there's enough people there that got equipment for making videos. And, you know, I think getting celebrity, I mean, it's brotherhoods don't like the attention, you know, and whatever rank you might be, probably, you know, oh man, I don't want that much, you know, spotlight and all that on me. It's not good for my health, but it's like celebrity gets to a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Okay. Any other comments or questions before we wrap it up? Appreciate everybody showing up. And we will, I'll be announcing the time next week. I'll contemplate the best time to do it next week, and we'll go from there.